The world of Flavio was a universe of calculated certainties built upon the solid foundation of his wealth and the predictability of his luxurious routine. On that Tuesday afternoon, he was waiting for Mariana inside his imported Mercedes, the smell of new leather still hanging in the air like a perfume of success. While he waited, his cell phone slipped from his hand, sliding into the gap between the driver's seat and the center console. Annoyed by the small inconvenience, he plunged his hand into the tight space, and his fingers, instead of the cold metal of the device, touched the rough texture of a cheap paper. It was a simple business card, yellowed at the edges, with a name printed in letters without any sophistication. Antonio Silva, followed by a phone number. For a man like Flavio, accustomed to embossed cards and minimalist design, that piece of paper was an anomaly, a strange and vulgar object in his sanctuary of opulence. A cold sensation began to creep up his spine, a dark intuition that name should not be there. That same night, the tension in the couple's penthouse was almost palpable, a stark contrast to the stunning view of the city lights twinkling outside. Flavio waited for the right moment, after dinner was served and the maid had withdrawn, to begin his interrogation. He did not scream or accuse. His method was much more cruel. He simply slid the business card across the marble table like a poker player revealing a decisive card. Mariana, who until then had been talking animatedly about an art gallery, stopped mid-sentence. The narrator, who inhabits every detail of life, could see the blood drain from her face, the sparkle in her eyes being replaced by a veiled panic that she desperately struggled to hide. "Who is Antonio Silva?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, but laden with a weight that filled the entire room. She stammered for a moment, her brain working a mile a minute to weave a lie that sounded minimally plausible. It's for a social project, my love, an initiative I'm helping to raise funds for underprivileged children." The lie came out tremulously, and to Flavio, it sounded as fake as a $3 bill. He just watched her, his silence being the clearest of accusations, solidifying in his mind the certainty that he was being betrayed. The days that followed were an exercise in silent torture. Flavio transformed into a meticulous observer, a hunter inside his own home. Every gesture of Mariana's was now filtered through the lens of his suspicion. He noticed how she hastily ended phone conversations when he entered the room, the way her smile no longer reached her eyes, and the sudden outings under increasingly vague pretexts. The lie about the social project echoed in his mind, repeating like a broken record, and each repetition made it more absurd and insulting. For a man who built an empire based on risk analysis and the elimination of variables, the uncertainty within his marriage was a cancer corroding his peace. The idea of hiring a private detective seemed impersonal and risky. The story could leak, tarnishing his reputation. No, he needed the raw truth without intermediaries. He needed to see with his own eyes, to feel the impact of the betrayal in real time. And it was on a sleepless dawn, while looking at the sleeping face of the woman he no longer recognized, that the idea emerged. As insane as it was perfect, he would become invisible. He would disguise himself as something his social circle would never notice. A taxi driver. The humiliation of the disguise was a small price to pay to regain control, to unmask what he was sure was the most painful of infidelities. While Flavio was consumed by his growing paranoia, Mariana lived imprisoned in a constant panic, an anguish that manifested as a permanent knot in her throat. She felt her husband's gaze upon her, a cold and inquisitive presence that followed her through every corner of that luxurious apartment that seemed more like a golden cage. Every word they exchanged was a minefield where one false step could detonate the bomb she had been guarding for 13 years. The weight of the secret was overwhelming, a second skin she wore that was slowly suffocating her. The woman Flavio knew, the sophisticated and cultured Mariana, with diplomat parents living in Europe and a comfortable family inheritance, was a work of fiction carefully assembled. The real Mariana, daughter of a housekeeper and a bricklayer, was a character she had killed and buried the day she fell in love with him. She lived with the absolute certainty that Flavio's love would not survive the truth. She knew him, knew his friends, their casual jokes about a different class of people, his veiled contempt for everything that did not exude wealth and pedigree. In a guilty whisper on the phone, she vented to Antonio, her voice choked with fear. "He found your card, Tonho. I don't know how much longer I can sustain this." He looked at me in a way, if he finds out, if he knows everything, I lose everything. He would never forgive me for being who I am. The execution of the plan was an experience of profound humiliation for Flavio, a voluntary descent to the lowest rungs of the social ladder he so despised. In a cheap hotel room, rented under a false name, he stripped himself of his identity. The Egyptian cotton shirts gave way to a worn-out t-shirt, the tailored trousers to faded jeans, and the Swiss wristwatch was replaced by a promotional cap that he pulled down over his head, hiding his eyes. Looking at himself in the cracked tile mirror of the bathroom, he didn't see the ruthless CEO, but an anonymous man, a face in the crowd, the kind of person he would never look at twice. The feeling was repulsive, but necessary. He took the rented car, a popular model with a smell of cigarettes poorly masked by a pine air freshener, and positioned it on a street adjacent to his building. His heart hammered against his ribs, a mixture of adrenaline and aversion. Then he saw her. Mariana came out of the doorman's entrance, elegant as always, but with tense shoulders. The moment she requested a car through the app, Flavio's phone, prepared to intercept the call, beeped. Her name shone on the screen. With sweating hands, he put it in first gear and went around the block. He stopped in front of her, his face down, and mumbled a good morning in a deliberately hoarse voice. She got in without recognizing him. The air inside the car became heavy, dense with secrets and a cruel irony that only the omniscient narrator could savor. Flavio drove mechanically, his knuckles white with tension on the steering wheel, while all his senses were focused on the image of his wife, reflected in the rearview mirror. She looked small and fragile in the back seat, an absolute contrast to the confident woman he saw at dinners and social events. She picked up her cell phone, and he held his breath. Name Antonio appeared on her screen before she brought it to her ear. Mariana's voice came out in a thread, laden with an anguish that hit him like a punch to the stomach. "Antonio, it's me. I'm on my way," she began. There was a pause, and then the words that would change everything began to pour out, a deluge of desperate confessions. "He's suspicious. I feel it. If he finds out the truth, Antonio, the truth about me, about where I came from, about my mother, I lied. I lied about practically everything in my life to fit into his world." Flavio felt his blood run cold. These were not the words of a lover. They were the words of someone terrified. "He is good, but he is too prejudiced. He would never accept who I really am. He would be disgusted by me, by my family." The word family ricocheted inside Flavio's skull, shattering his theory of betrayal into 1,000 pieces and opening an abyss of confusion and dread beneath his feet. What could be worse than a lover? What truth was this, so terrible, that made her build a charade for 13 years? The rest of the journey was covered in a deafening silence, filled only by the hum of the engine and the chaos that had been unleashed in Flavio's mind. Every certainty he had about his life, about his wife, had disintegrated in a matter of seconds. The fury that had fueled him, the certainty of betrayal that had moved him to commit that madness, all dissipated, giving way to a dizzying confusion and an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't name. It was her voice, repeating in his head the phrase that had hit him with the force of a punch. Too prejudiced. Him, prejudiced. He saw himself as a man of refined tastes, a man who appreciated the best in life, But her accusation, spoken in secret to a stranger, sounded like an irrefutable truth, a verdict on his character that he had never considered. As the car moved forward, he noticed that the urban landscape was changing drastically. The glass and steel skyscrapers of Faria Lima gave way to lower buildings, to neighborhood stores with colorful signs, and finally to narrower streets and simple houses with peeling walls and tangled electrical wires on the posts. He was entering the East Zone, a territory that to him was as exotic and distant as a foreign country. The physical journey to the city's periphery was a perfect mirror of his internal journey, a forced dive out of his bubble of privilege and ignorance. The navigation app announced with a metallic and impersonal voice, "You have arrived at your destination." The destination was a quiet, tree-lined street with modest but well-kept semi-detached houses. The car stopped in front of a small two-story house with an iron gate painted green and a small garden in front where a few rose bushes struggled to bloom. Mariana paid for the ride with a crumpled bill, her eyes still lost in worry, without even looking at the face of the driver who was her husband. Flavio watched, paralyzed, as she got out of the car and walked with a disconcerting familiarity to that gate. She knocked lightly twice. The door opened, and an older woman with grey hair and a face marked by time appeared. What followed shocked Flavio even more than the phone conversation. Mariana shed her upright and controlled posture and threw herself into the arms of that lady in a long and desperate hug, a daughter's hug seeking refuge in her mother's lap. After a moment, the two went inside, and the door closed, leaving Flavio outside, alone in the rented car, with his world turned upside down. Who was that woman? And why was Mariana, whose mother supposedly lived in Geneva, hugging her with so much love and pain at that address forgotten by the São Paulo elite? The hunt for a lover was over. Now began the search for his wife's true identity. Time stood still for Flavio inside that stuffy car. The minutes dragged on, turning into hours, while the afternoon sun descended and painted the sky with shades of orange and purple that he barely noticed. The image of Mariana's embrace with the unknown woman was etched in his retinas, a puzzle whose pieces he couldn't even identify, let alone assemble. The anger that had once consumed him had metamorphosed into something much more complex and painful. It was the pain of exclusion, the realization that there was a whole universe of feelings, fears, and affections in his wife's life of which he was not a part. Worse, he was the reason why that universe had to remain hidden. The accusation of being prejudiced hammered at his conscience, no longer as an offense, but as a mirror he was forced to face. Was he, in fact, the cause of that 13-year lie? The idea was so unbearable, it left him breathless. He took the business card out of his pocket. Antonio Silva, this man whom he had imagined to be a lover, was now his only bridge to the truth. Waiting there, watching the house like a criminal, would lead to nothing. He needed concrete answers, facts that could make some sense of that chaos. With a renewed and somber determination, he started the car and drove away from that street, leaving behind the scene that had demolished his world with a new and clear objective in mind. Back in the impersonal hotel room, the smell of mold and disinfectant contrasting violently with the fragrances of his real life, Flavio regained control in the only way he knew how, through power and influence. He picked up his cell phone, the real one, and dialed the number of his head of security, a former policeman named Borges, a man of few words and absolute efficiency. Flavio's voice came out firm, not betraying the storm raging inside him. "Borges, good evening. I need a complete and urgent background check. It's confidential." He dictated the name and phone number from the card, inventing a story about a background check for a delicate business partnership, a lie that sounded professional and dispassionate. "I want everything you can find on this man, address, job, records, and especially any link, any kind of association, however tenuous, with my wife, Mariana Alencar de Toledo. The emphasis on her married name was deliberate, a reminder to himself of the facade they shared. I need this by tomorrow morning without fail. Upon hanging up, the silence of the room swallowed him. The power he wielded so easily in the business world seemed like a cruel joke in the face of the abyss of his personal ignorance. He, Flavio Toledo, the titan of industry, was a complete stranger to the woman he had been sleeping with for over a decade. Now, all he could do was wait for the data that could finally begin to fill the gaps or destroy what little was left for good. The next morning found Flavio exactly as the night had left him, awake, tense, and haunted by an infinity of unanswered questions. He hadn't slept a wink, spending the hours pacing back and forth on the worn carpet of the hotel room, a lion caged in his own agony. The sunrise, which he watched through the dirty window, brought no relief, only the promise of a day that would define the rest of his life. Shortly after 8, his cell phone vibrated. It was an email from Borges, with the subject, "Confidential Report." Flavio's heart raced. He sat on the edge of the bed, typed the password with trembling fingers, and opened the file. The document was cold, impersonal, a list of facts that contrasted brutally with the whirlwind of emotions consuming him. The first item hit him like a blast of cold wind. Antonio Silva, 45 years old, married, father of 2 children. Profession, social worker. Employer, NGO, Lazos de Apoyo, ties of support, specializing in providing logistical and emotional support for families of cancer patients undergoing treatment in the public health system. Flavio reread the sentence 3 times. Social worker, cancer. Mariana's lie about the social project returned to his mind, no longer as a complete farce, but as a terribly distorted truth, a half-truth used as a shield to hide something much bigger. The floor began to crumble beneath his feet as he scrolled down the page, his breath caught in his chest towards the part of the report he most feared, Antonio's connections with his wife. It was there, in the section titled Links of Interest, that Flavio's world imploded for good. Mariana's name was not listed directly next to Antonio's. Instead, there was another name, Lucia Pereira, 62 years old. The report succinctly described that Mrs. Pereira was one of the people assisted by Antonio's NGO, receiving help with transportation and scheduling appointments. And then, the final line, the sentence that redefined 13 years of his life. Lucia Pereira is the biological mother of Mariana Pereira, maiden name of Mrs. Mariana Alencar de Toledo. The cell phone almost fell from his hand. Lucia, his mother-in-law, the woman he believed to be living a life of luxury in Switzerland, was in fact a sick, elderly woman, a resident of the East Zone, depending on the help of an NGO to fight her own mortality. The report included a photo of Donna Lucia, and it was her, the woman from the embrace, the tired yet serene face he had seen the day before. The last piece of information in the dossier was the coup de grace diagnosis, adenocarcinoma of the pancreas, advanced stage. In that instant, Flavio felt the weight of 13 years of lies crash down on him, not with anger, but with an overwhelming wave of shame and pain. Mariana wasn't cheating on him. She was facing the illness and imminent loss of her mother, alone, in secret, because she judged him incapable of loving her through the truth. The word prejudiced finally found its place, searing itself into his soul like a branding iron. Sitting on the edge of that unfamiliar bed, Flavio felt the weight of every single one of his 4,745 days of marriage collapse onto his shoulders. Every laugh, every trip, every elegant dinner, everything now seemed like a scene from a play whose script only he didn't know. His mind, once an archive of successes and achievements, had become a torture chamber, endlessly projecting all the times he, with his veiled arrogance, had reinforced Mariana's fear. He remembered a party years ago where one of his friends made a joke about people who come from far away to try to make a life, and he had laughed along. He remembered his own criticisms of a businessman who, despite being rich, had no pedigree, didn't know how to carry himself. Every memory was a stab to his conscience, one more brick in the wall that he, unknowingly, had built between them. Guilt was a poison spreading through his veins, a guilt not only for his ignorance, but for having been the author of the coercion that forced her to live like a fugitive within her own home. He, who prided himself on giving her the life of a queen, now understood that he had only given her a more beautiful cage. The need to repair, to ask for forgiveness, to at least share the burden she carried alone, became a physical urgency. He stood up, put on his suit like a suit of armor to hide his vulnerability, and drove back home, not as a judge, but as a defendant on his way to his own sentencing. He found her in the living room, her back to the door, watching the city through the immense glass wall. The apartment was silent, impeccable, a mausoleum of luxury and secrets. When he entered, she startled, turning around with shock stamped on her pale face. She had probably just returned from one of her secret visits, her heart still torn between two worlds. Flavio stopped a few feet away, and for a moment just watched her. He didn't see the socialite, the perfect hostess. He saw the exhausted woman from the back of the taxi, the devoted daughter at the door of the green two-story house, the actress at the end of a 13-year performance. He didn't brandish Borges's dossier like a weapon, didn't mention the disguise, the chase, the humiliation. He chose the most direct and, at the same time, the most devastating path. He let the silence hang for a moment, a vacuum where all their lies floated, and then, with a voice choked by a pain that was as much hers as his, he asked the only question that mattered, the key that would open the vault of her past. He looked her in the eyes, allowing her to see all his anguish, and asked, "Mariana, how is your mother?" The question hung in the air, simple, terrible, and definitive. It was not an accusation, it was an acknowledgement. And for Mariana, it was the sound of the entire world breaking in two, the end of the charade, the collapse of a lifetime of fear. The impact of those 5 words was more violent than a physical blow. Mariana felt the floor disappear from under her feet, a vertigo that made her stagger backward, steadying herself on a designer armchair that, in that moment, was just a piece of wood and fabric. The mask she had worn for so long not only fell, it shattered, and the shards revealed a naked face, flooded with a primal terror. Her lips parted, but no sound came out, just a gasp, the air of 13 years of lies escaping her lungs all at once. For her, that question was not just proof that he knew, it was the confirmation of her worst nightmare coming true. His gaze was not one of fury, as she had always imagined, but something much worse. It was a look of deep pain, a pain that mirrored hers, and this unexpected compassion completely disarmed her. The barriers she had so carefully built, the fortress of deceit that protected her, crumbled in an instant. The tears she had swallowed for more than a decade finally overflowed, streaming down her face in silent cascades. There was nowhere left to run. The war was over, and she surrendered, exhausted and completely defeated, awaiting the final sentence. "She's not well," was the first thing Mariana managed to say, her voice hoarse and broken, a confession in itself. And then, like a dam breaking, it all came out, a torrent of painful truths that gushed out without order, without pause, driven by the urgency of someone drowning. "My mother isn't in Switzerland, Flavio. She never was. She lives in a little house in the East Zone, and she has cancer. Her name is Lucia, and she was a housekeeper her whole life. My father, who I said was an investor, was a bricklayer. He died in a work accident when I was 17. With each sentence, a part of the character she had created died. I didn't go to a private school. I went to a public school. College wasn't in Europe. It was at USP at night, while I worked as a saleswoman in a shoe store on Rua Direita to help pay the bills at home. I have 4 siblings, Flavio. I'm not an only child. She stopped, gasping for air, and confessed the most fundamental lie of all. "Even the way we met, it wasn't an accident. I saw you in a magazine, I researched you, I created a person I thought you would accept, that your world would accept. I lied about everything from the very first day because I fell in love with you with all my soul, and I had a certainty, an absolute certainty, that you would never look at the real Mariana, the housekeeper's daughter, the shoe saleswoman. I was afraid you would be disgusted by me." Flavio remained motionless as the flood of confessions hit him, each word landing with the weight of a stone on his chest. He listened to everything without saying a single word, his brain struggling to process the image of his wife, the woman who discussed French wines and contemporary art with him, selling high heels to hurried women in the city center. He tried to visualize her mother, not in a Swiss villa, but in a simple two-story house, fighting a terminal illness, while her daughter lived a lie to protect her, and at the same time to protect herself from him. A feeling of grief washed over him, but it wasn't grief for the false image of Mariana that had died. It was grief for the lost time, for the unimaginable pain she had endured in silence, just a few feet away from him, in the same bed, in the same house. He realized that, for 13 years, he had never truly been with her. He had been with a representative, an ambassador of a version of herself she believed was the only one acceptable. The realization that he was the source of this fear, the catalyst for this monumental farce, was a bitter pill, a poison that burned down his throat and settled in his stomach. The pain didn't come from the lie about money or status, but from the lie about love. She loved him so much that she believed his love was too shallow to survive the truth. Before him, Mariana trembled, her body hunched as if expecting the final blow. The rejection she had rehearsed in her worst nightmares for over a decade. She expected the screams, the accusation of being a con artist, the order to get out of his life. And it was in that moment of expecting pain that something inside Flavio, something he didn't even know existed, broke. It was his pride, his arrogance, the subtle prejudice he had always denied possessing. All of it shattered at the sight of the woman he loved, reduced to a well of suffering because of him. He took a step forward, then another, closing the physical distance that was a symbol of the emotional distance that separated them. His own eyes filled with tears, not of anger, but of a compassion and shame so deep they suffocated him. He no longer wanted to know about the lies. The lies were the symptom. He wanted to know the cause, the truth, the root of it all. Stopping a hand's breadth from her, he raised his hand, not to accuse, but to gently wipe away one of her tears with his thumb. His voice came out low but firm, with the resolution of a man who has just found a new purpose. "I don't want to hear about the lie anymore, Mariana," he said. "I want to know the truth. I want to meet your mother. I want to meet your siblings. I need to meet the family that raised the extraordinary woman who hid from me for so long." Flavio's words hit Mariana with the force of a wave, but instead of drowning her, they seemed to cleanse her of a filth she had carried for years. She stared at him, her eyes teary and her mouth agape, unable to formulate a response. Her mind, programmed for the worst-case scenario, had no script for this. Rejection, fury, contempt. She was ready for all of it, but for acceptance, for the genuine desire to know her truth, she was not prepared. She scrutinized him, searching for the slightest hint of a trick, a trap, but found nothing but a vulnerability she had never seen in him, a broken man, just like her. The phrase, "I need to meet the family that raised the extraordinary woman who hid from me," was the absolution she had never dared to dream of. It was the validation of her existence, a recognition that the real Mariana, Donna Lucia's daughter, was not a monster to be. Hidden, but someone worthy of being known. A new emotion, fragile and trembling, began to sprout amidst the rubble of her fear. Hope. Unable to speak, She just nodded her head, a slow, hesitant movement that sealed the end of an era of lies and the beginning of a terrifying and uncertain future. For the first time in 13 years, the crushing weight of her secret began, millimeter by millimeter, to lift from her back. The journey to the East Zone that night was the longest and most silent of their lives. They went in Flavio's Mercedes, the same vehicle that had served as the stage for the discovery of the card and for the suspicion that almost destroyed them. Now, the luxury car, a symbol of the world that had forced Mariana to hide, seemed like an alien invader gliding through the increasingly simple streets of her neighborhood. The silence between them was not hostile, but dense, laden with everything that had been said and everything that still needed to be felt. Flavio kept his hands firm on the steering wheel, but his gaze was not just on the road. He looked at the corner bakeries, at the groups of young people talking on the sidewalks, at the facades of the houses, trying to absorb every detail of the universe that had formed his wife. He didn't see poverty, as he might have before. He saw life, he saw community, he saw the raw material of the strong and resilient woman he was just beginning to know. Mariana, by his side, watched her husband's face, trying to decipher his thoughts, her heart beating uncontrollably with a mixture of dread and anticipation. When he turned onto her mother's street and the small two-story house with the green gate appeared at the end of the block, they both held their breath. They weren't just arriving at a house, they were arriving at the starting point of a new life, and neither of them knew if they would be strong enough to build it. Getting out of the car was like crossing an invisible border. The presence of the black, gleaming Mercedes on that street was an anomaly, a monolith of wealth that attracted curious glances from neighboring windows, making Flavio feel more exposed than ever in his life. He, who was used to being the center of attention, now felt like an intruder, a spectator of a reality that did not belong to him. Mariana walked ahead, her steps hesitant, and stopped before the green gate. She did not knock. Instead, she took a deep breath, as if drawing courage from the very air of that neighborhood, and called out with a slightly trembling voice, "Mine?" Seconds later, the door opened, and there she was, Donna Lucia. In person, she was even more fragile than in the report's photo. The illness had left its marks, the pallor, the visible exhaustion in her slumped shoulders. But what shocked Flavio was the light that radiated from her eyes upon seeing her daughter, an expression of love so pure and unconditional that it left him breathless. Then, the mother's gaze moved to him. The initial confusion gave way to a silent understanding, and a comprehensible caution took over her features. She saw before her not just a stranger, but the enigma that had inhabited her daughter's life for over a decade. With a choked voice, barely able to pronounce the words she had kept secret for so long, Mariana built the bridge between her two worlds. This is Flavio, my husband." The word husband sounded strange and at the same time terribly definitive in that small garden. Donna Lucia looked from Flavio to Mariana and back at him. There was no awe on her face that he was used to provoking, nor the resentment he perhaps deserved. There was only the dignity of a matriarch facing the unknown to protect her child. She offered a tired but genuine smile and extended her hand towards him. "Welcome, Flavio. The house is humble, but it's always open." The simple gesture and words, devoid of any affectation, broke through Flavio's armor. He entered, and the interior of the house embraced him. It was small, the furniture was old, but everything was impeccably clean and tidy. On the living room wall, a collection of picture frames told the story that had been denied to him. Mariana, with braces on her teeth, hugging a man with a mustache whom he presumed to be her father. Photos of graduations, of birthday parties, of siblings he didn't know existed. Flavio, the man who dominated meetings and multi-million-dollar negotiations, was speechless. He was at the epicenter of Mariana's truth, and the only thing he could feel was the warmth of a real home, something his cold and silent mansion had never had. Flavio's contemplative silence was broken by the sound of the back door opening, followed by lively voices that brought a gust of life into the room. Two men entered the living room, both with the appearance of someone who knows hard work. The older one, with strong arms and an easy smile that resembled the man in the photographs, stopped abruptly upon seeing the visitors. The younger one, with a shrewd and curious look, stopped right behind him. "Marie, you here at this hour?" said the older one, his smile faltering as he noticed the tension on his sister's face and the imposing, out-of-place presence of Flavio. Mariana, looking like a little girl again, introduced them with a still, fragile voice. "Flavio, these are my brothers, Carlos and Ricardo." The brothers sized him up, without any attempt to hide their suspicion. It wasn't the envy Flavio was used to seeing in the eyes of others. It was a protective instinct, a raw analysis of the man who, to them, was just a whispered name, a mysterious entity from their sister's other world. Flavio extended his hand, and Carlos's handshake was firm, the callus on his palm telling a story of labor that Flavio only knew from his company's reports. In that moment, he wasn't the boss, the millionaire. He was just Mariana's husband, and he had to prove his worth from scratch. It was Donna Lucia who, with her silent wisdom, acted to dissolve the tension. "Stop the ceremony and come to the kitchen. I'll make some fresh coffee for us," she said, her voice sounding like a gentle command that no one would dare disobey. The small kitchen was the heart of the house, imbued with the smell of garlic, of freshly baked cake, and of countless family conversations. Flavio sat in a wooden chair that creaked under his weight, feeling disproportionately large and clumsy. They served the coffee in ceramic cups with small flaws, each one different from the other. It was Ricardo, the younger one, who broke the ice with a question as direct as an arrow. "So you do exist? We were already thinking Mari had made you up." The question, which would have been an insult in his world, here sounded almost affectionate, a brother-in-law's tease. Flavio didn't know what to answer. He looked at Mariana, who watched him with her heart in her hands, and then at his mother-in-law, who offered him a piece of cornmeal cake. He took the cup, the heat seeping through the ceramic, and took a sip of the strong, sweet coffee. The taste was intense, real, without the complex nuances of his gourmet beans. It was the taste of that house, of that family. And as the hot liquid went down his throat, he understood that that simple kitchen table was the most important meeting room he had ever been in, and that the approval of these people was worth more than any contract he had ever signed. Inhaling the aroma of the coffee and the courage he didn't know he possessed, Flavio finally found his voice. He lifted his eyes from the cup and looked directly at Ricardo, then at Carlos, and finally at Mariana, who was watching him with a mixture of dread and supplication. "I think you're right," he said, his voice low and hoarse, devoid of any artifice. "Looking back now, maybe the one who didn't really exist was me, or at least the man she thought I was." That unexpected confession, an admission of guilt and self-criticism, hung in the kitchen air, completely disarming the brothers. Carlos, the more pragmatic one, relaxed his shoulders and leaned back in his chair. "We were always worried," he admitted, in a softer tone. "Mari was always the smartest one, the one who dreamed bigger. When she got married and moved to that other world, we were scared. Scared that this world would swallow her up, that she would forget where she came from. Not out of malice, but because that's how life is." He smiled, a memory lighting up his face, but she never forgot. "Every week she's here helping Mom, bringing a treat, even when we can see she's tired, with sad eyes." Each word was a glimpse of a Mariana that Flavio didn't know, a woman whose loyalty and strength were not acquired with marriage, but forged in that humble house. The conversation, now more fluid, inevitably drifted to the gravitational center of that family, Donna Lucia's health. The lightness gave way to a tone of shared concern, a cloud that constantly hung over them. It was the matriarch herself who brought up the subject with a naturalness that shocked Flavio. "This week the chemo was hard. The body gets weak. You barely have the will to get up, she said, without a hint of self-pity, just stating a fact. Good thing that Mr. Antonio managed to move up the appointment at the hospital. He's an angel who appeared in our lives. He makes everything easier, talks to the doctors. If it weren't for him, the casual and grateful mention of the name that had been the source of his private torture was like a final seal on the truth. Antonio Silva was not a rival. He was a pillar of support, a stranger doing the job that he, the husband, should have been doing. Flavio looked at Mariana and saw in her eyes the reflection of countless tiring trips to the hospital, of sleepless nights of worry, of a financial and emotional burden she carried alone out of shame of him. In that instant, an overwhelming clarity took over his mind. All his money, all his power, all his influence, what good were they if they couldn't alleviate the suffering of the people he was supposed to love and protect? An unshakable resolution formed in his heart. That was going to change, starting from that exact moment. With the coffee cup still in his hand, a visible change occurred in Flavio. The hesitation and discomfort that had paralyzed him gave way to a clarity of purpose he normally reserved for the boardroom. That humble environment did not diminish his strength. On the contrary, it seemed to have given him a much more powerful reason to use it. He placed the cup on the table with a firm sound and looked directly at his mother-in-law, his eyes filled with a new and serene authority. "Donna Lucia, forgive my intrusion, but this situation ends today," he declared, his voice calm but unquestionable. "You will no longer depend on favors or face difficulties for your treatment. I will take care of everything. From now on, your only concern will be to feel better." He then turned to the brothers, his gaze taking in everyone in the small kitchen, but finally resting on Mariana. "And this is not up for discussion. You have spent years taking care of each other. Now let me take care of you." The family fell into absolute silence, a silence of pure disbelief. They looked from Flavio to Mariana, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. For Mariana, it was like seeing the sun rise after a 13-year night. It was the man she had fallen in love with, the giant, but now his strength was being used to protect her, not to intimidate her. Without waiting for a response, Flavio stood up, took his cell phone from his pocket, and stepped back, as if to give them space to breathe. They heard him dial a number and then speak with a politeness and authority that seemed to belong to another planet. "Dr. Montero, this is Flavio Toledo. Forgive me for calling like this without notice. I need to schedule an emergency consultation for my mother-in-law." The family exchanged astonished glances upon hearing the name of the most famous oncologist in Brazil. "Her name is Lucia Pereira. I want a complete re-evaluation at your hospital as soon as possible. Tomorrow? Perfect." He ended the call and turned back to them, the plan already fully formed in his mind. "Tomorrow morning, a private ambulance will come to pick you up, Donna Lucia, and after the consultation, you will not come back here." He paused, looking into Mariana's eyes, which were already filled with tears. "You are going to live with us, in our apartment. You will have a room just for you, with every comfort and a nursing team at your disposal. You need to be close to your daughter, and I need my mother-in-law close to me." The offer was not just a gesture of generosity, it was an act of inclusion, a formal invitation for Mariana's family to become a real part of his life. It was the final demolition of the wall that separated them. The silence that followed Flavio's proposal was broken by a low sound, a contained sob that came from Donna Lucia. The matriarch, who faced illness and hardship with stoic strength, finally allowed herself to break down. Tears streamed down her tired face, not tears of sadness, but of a gratitude so overwhelming it seemed to hurt. For months, her greatest fear was not death, but the burden she had become for her children, especially for Mariana, whom she saw splitting herself in. Two to be by her side. Flavio's offer was not just a logistical relief, it was permission for her to fight for her life without worrying about dragging her children down with her. Carlos and Ricardo, the tough brothers, were dumbfounded, their eyes shining. The entire armor of suspicion they had built against this rich man melted away, replaced by a silent and profound respect. Ricardo, the provocateur, just shook his head, swallowing hard, while Carlos reached across the table and squeezed his brother-in-law's arm in a gesture of approval and brotherhood that was worth more than any words. In that small kitchen, the barriers of class, money, and secrets had been completely dissolved, leaving behind only the pulsating core of a family uniting in adversity. In the midst of her family's commotion, Mariana remained paralyzed, watching the man she thought she knew transform before her eyes. He approached her, and when their gazes met, she saw the promise of everything he had said reflected in his eyes. Then, for the first time in front of her family, he did something that changed everything. He hugged her. It was not a formal hug, but a possessive and protective gesture, pulling her close to him, as if telling the world and her that they were a team, an inseparable unit. And in that embrace, Mariana allowed herself to truly cry. They were loud, convulsive sobs, the release of 13 years of fear, of loneliness, of a tension so constant that she had forgotten what it was like to live without it. She cried for the girl who sold shoes, for the young woman who studied to exhaustion, for the woman who lied for love, and for the fear that this love was not strong enough. Flavio did not ask her to stop. He just held her tighter, letting her wash her soul right there on his shoulder. In that moment, in her mother's humble kitchen, Flavio and Mariana's old marriage died, and a new one, forged in truth, in pain, and in a newfound compassion, began to be born. The next morning was born different in Flavio and Mariana's penthouse. The sun that streamed through the immense windows no longer illuminated a cold silence and a void of appearances, but a house awakening to a new purpose. For the first time in years, that space, which felt more like a cold art gallery, began to resemble a home. Flavio, the man who commanded hundreds of employees with a simple phone call, was personally supervising the transformation of one of the guest rooms. He instructed the staff with a kindness that surprised everyone, helping to choose softer sheets and position a comfortable armchair near the window. Mariana was by his side, not as the trophy wife who merely nodded, but as an active partner whose opinion he sought at every step. There was a new language between them, composed of complicit glances and discreet touches, an intimacy forged in crisis and solidified in action. For Flavio, preparing that room for the mother-in-law he didn't even know existed 48 hours ago was the most significant act of his adult life, a way to rebuild his own house on a foundation that was, finally, true. In the early afternoon, Flavio's promise materialized in the form of a private ambulance that stopped discreetly at the building's entrance. Donna Lucia came up in the private elevator, and when the doors opened directly into the living room, she found herself before a world she only knew from photographs and imagination. Sitting in the wheelchair, she looked like a fragile queen, inspecting a new and vast kingdom. Her eyes scanned the double-height ceiling, the Italian marble, the spectacular view of São Paulo that stretched to the horizon. But the narrator who knew her soul knew she was not impressed by the wealth. What moved her to tears was the sight of her daughter, standing beside her husband, waiting for her with a smile she hadn't seen in years, a smile free from fear. Flavio came forward, knelt beside the wheelchair to be at her eye level, and took her hand. "Welcome to your home, Lucia," he said, his voice soft, using her first name as a final invitation for her to be part of the family. In that moment, Donna Lucia did not see the millionaire son-in-law. She saw the man who had returned peace to her daughter, and that for her was the greatest wealth that existed. The weeks that followed were a period of adaptation and discovery for everyone. The penthouse, once a sanctuary of silence and order, gained a new soul. The sterile routine was replaced by the flow of real life. The soft sound of the TV in the room where Donna Lucia rested, the smell of homemade seasonings that Mariana now made a point of preparing, and the constant visits from Carlos and Ricardo. The brothers, at first, entered the apartment with the caution of someone stepping on sacred ground. But soon, formality gave way to comfort. They brought cheese bread from the neighborhood bakery, told stories from work, and filled the environment with their laughter, treating their millionaire brother-in-law with the same camaraderie they would use with any neighbor. Flavio, for his part, found himself deliberately shortening his long days at the office. He felt drawn home, not by the opulence, but by the chance to sit next to Lucia and listen to her tell stories of Mariana's childhood, of a life of hardships overcome with a dignity that humbled him. He was receiving an education that no elite university could offer him, a lesson on resilience, faith, and the true meaning of family. This internal transformation, nurtured daily in his home, began to inevitably overflow into his professional life. Flavio started walking the corridors of his company with a new perspective. He no longer saw just employees. He saw human beings. He saw the receptionist and wondered if she had a sick mother. He saw the cleaning boy and wondered about the dreams he nurtured for his children. One day, while passing through the cafeteria, he noticed one of his logistics managers, a competent yet reserved man, eating alone with an expression of deep exhaustion. The old Flavio would have walked right by, considering it a personal problem irrelevant to the business. The new Flavio stopped. He sat at the table, asked about the man's day, and with a kindness that surprised him, asked if everything was okay. The manager, shocked by the CEO's attention, vented about the marathon of caring for his father, who had suffered a stroke. That same day, Flavio summoned his HR director and announced a revolution. He ordered the creation of a new benefits plan with health insurance extended to employees' parents, a relief fund for family emergencies, and a flexible hours program. The value of this company is not on the balance sheet. It's in the lives of the people who build it, he declared at the meeting, to the astonishment of his executives. If we are not a family here inside as well, then everything we have done until today has been in vain. In the midst of this new and hectic routine, the intimacy between Flavio and Mariana blossomed in a way neither of them thought possible. The nights, which were once filled with a polite and distant silence, were now the stage for long conversations on the balcony, under the glow of the city that no longer seemed so arrogant. With the truth between them, Mariana shed the character she had created. She became bolder, more fun, and began to challenge him with strong opinions, laughing at him when he tried, unsuccessfully, to cook something for her mother. Flavio, in turn, delighted in this new woman, the real Mariana, whose intelligence and insight went far beyond any socialite he had ever known. He found himself asking for her advice on company matters, valuing her point of view, which came from a place of pure empathy and popular wisdom. On one of those nights, he held her hand and confessed, his voice choked. "I spent 13 years loving a perfect painting, Mariana, but only now knowing the artist, the real woman. With her scars and her vibrant colors, have I discovered what true love is. I love the woman you are, not the one you thought I wanted." About 2 months later, late one afternoon, the phone rang. It was Dr. Montero, with the results of Lucia's latest exams. The whole family gathered in the living room, a circle of nervousness and hope. Carlos and Ricardo were there, standing, biting their nails, while Flavio held Mariana's hand, who answered the call on speakerphone. The doctor's voice was calm, professional, but there was a tone of restrained excitement in it. He explained that Lucia's response to the new treatment, a state-of-the-art targeted molecular therapy, had been extraordinary, far beyond any expectation. The main tumor had regressed by almost 60%, and the markers had plummeted. It was not a cure, he made sure to stress, but it was the closest thing to a miracle that medicine could offer. It was time, a precious and unexpected time that had been granted to them, A cry of relief and joy escaped from Mariana, who broke down in tears and threw herself into Flavio's arms. The brothers hugged each other, crying and laughing at the same time. In that moment, Flavio's money was not just power or luxury. It was the tool that, combined with the love and unity of that family, had brought a little more life. And for everyone there, that was the only victory that mattered. To celebrate the blessing of the news they received, the following weekend was the stage for an event that marked the foundation of the family's new life. Flavio and Mariana organized a barbecue, but not a cocktail party with canapes and background music, as would be expected in their social circle. It was a barbecue in its purest essence, transported to the unlikely setting of the vast penthouse balcony. A stainless steel grill, the most modern on the market, had been installed, and on its gleaming grate, pieces of picanha and Tuscan sausage sizzled, releasing a smoke with an aroma. That, for Flavio, was the new perfume of success. The scene was a study in delicious contrasts. The homemade farofa and vibrant vinaigrette arranged in simple ceramic bowls on an Italian designer table, and the sound of lively pagode music echoing softly against the glass that reflected the immensity of São Paulo. Flavio, in a transformation that went far beyond the casual clothes he wore, moved with a lightness and joy that were contagious. He was no longer the formal host, ensuring everyone was served, but an active participant in the celebration. He spent a long time by the grill, receiving a detailed lesson from his brother-in-law, Carlos, on the secrets of a good barbecue, listening with a genuine attention he once only dedicated to merger and acquisition proposals. Later, under the amused gaze of his sisters-in-law, he ventured to prepare a round of caipirinhas, laughing at his own clumsiness in muddling the limes. His laughter, loud and uninhibited, was a novelty for Mariana, who watched him from afar with a heart overflowing. He was discovering a form of happiness that came not from possession or power, but from the simple and profound joy of connection, of sharing, of belonging to something real and loud. In a moment of greater tranquility, as the afternoon sun began to set, tinting the sky with orange hues, Flavio sat next to Donna Lucia. She was comfortably settled in an armchair, observing the movement with a serene smile. Her appearance was visibly healthier. A glow of life had returned to her eyes. "You know, my son," she told him, her voice still soft, but with a new firmness, "I spent so many years worried about my Mariana. I would see her come home, to my house, with a smile on her face, but her eyes told another story, a story of loneliness. I prayed to God that she would find not a rich man, but a man who would see her, who would see the strength and the gold she has inside." She extended her hand and placed it on Flavio's. "It took you a while to adjust your focus, but when you finally managed to see, it was her soul that you found. Thank you, Flavio. Thank you for giving my daughter the peace she deserved." The celebration had a guest of honor, whose presence sealed the cycle of distrust and pain. Antonio Silva, the social worker, arrived with his wife and their 2 children, bringing a bakery cake as a gift. Flavio made a point of receiving him at the elevator door, and the meeting of the 2 men was charged with deep meaning. There they were, the supposed lover and the deceived husband, but reality had transformed them into allies. "Antonio," said Flavio, shaking the man's hand with a warmth and sincerity that surprised him. "I want you to know that I know everything about your support, your help, your decency, and I want to ask for your forgiveness for one day having thought the worst. You were a pillar for this family when I was blinded by my own arrogance. Please make yourself at home." Later, amidst the party, Flavio called Antonio for a private conversation in his office. The environment, once a symbol of cold corporate power, would now serve as the stage for a proposal of a different kind. "Antonio, I am a businessman," Flavio began, "and I know how to recognize a successful model. What you do, your work is a success, but the scale is limited. Your NGO is a lifeboat in an ocean of need. I've spent the last few weeks studying this. the bureaucracy, the lack of resources, the families who give up halfway. It's a cruel system. Flavio turned his computer screen towards Antonio, showing not stock market shares, but a social action plan with graphs, projections, and an organizational chart. I want to propose a partnership. I want to come in with the capital, with the management, with the structure, and the influence I have, so that you can do what you do best, but on a scale 1,000 times larger. I want you and your experience to be the heart of a new institution, one that can change the reality of thousands of people. Flavio's voice was that of a CEO closing the biggest deal of his life. I want you to be the president, with carte blanche to assemble your team and manage the projects. This is not charity. It's an investment in the only thing that truly matters. The Lucia Pereira Foundation was announced to the family that same night. The emotion was indescribable. Donna Lucia cried silently upon learning that her name, the name of a simple woman, a housekeeper, would be a symbol of hope for so many. The institution was born with the strength of a giant, financed by Flavio's fortune, but guided by Mariana's soul and Antonio's experience. For Flavio, each step of the process was an act of atonement and construction. He was personally involved in every detail, from choosing the land for the headquarters to negotiating partnerships with hospitals and laboratories. The foundation quickly became a transformative force. We see its impact in the story of a teenager from the interior of Bahia, who accompanied her mother in her treatment and dreamed of being a doctor. The foundation not only paid for the mother's treatment, but through a new scholarship program created by Mariana, ensured that the young woman could finish her studies and get into medical school. With each success story, Flavio felt he was paying a debt not to God or to fate, but to his own conscience. Mariana found her true calling in the foundation. The woman who had spent years hiding behind a facade of sophistication now used her story as her main work tool. She led support groups, shared her journey, her lies and her fears, and in doing so, created an instant and powerful connection with the families. She was no longer Dr. Flavio Toledo's wife. She was Mariana, Lucia's daughter, a woman who understood pain and who knew from her own experience that hope was real. The family's prosperity also flourished organically and with dignity. Flavio sat down with his brothers-in-law and instead of simply giving them money, helped them set up a solid business plan to expand their auto repair shop. He connected them with consultants, facilitated a low-interest loan, and guided them in management. Carlos and Ricardo, with the talent and work ethic they always had, seized the opportunity, and in 2 years, their shop became a modern and respected automotive center in the East Zone, creating jobs and immense pride for the whole family. Time moved on. 3 years. After the beginning of that journey, life had settled into a new and happy normality. Donna Lucia, with stable health, was the joy of the house. A full-time grandmother who spoiled Mariana's nephews and supervised the kitchen with an affection that turned any dish into a banquet. Flavio's penthouse no longer knew silence. It was a living space, a meeting point where the doors were always open and there was always a pot of coffee ready to be brewed. The definitive proof of Flavio's change manifested on one of the rare occasions he and Mariana attended a social event from their old world. A banker, known for his elitist views, was complaining about the new generation of entrepreneurs without pedigree, who, according to him, lacked the necessary sophistication for business. The old Flavio would have agreed or remained silent. The new Flavio intervened. The greatest sophistication that exists, Claudio, is that of resilience, he said, his voice calm but firm, drawing the attention of the table. It's the sophistication of someone who builds a business from scratch, without the privilege of our starting point. I've had the honor of meeting many of these entrepreneurs through my foundation. Most of them have more grit and vision for the future than we will ever have. The silence that followed was profound. Mariana looked at her husband, and her heart filled with a love that was almost reverence. He was no longer defending her or her family in secret. He was defending the dignity of an entire people in public without fear of the consequences for his image. He had become the man she, in her most secret dreams, always knew he could be. They left the party shortly after, not because they felt offended, but because they felt that that environment had become sterile for them. In the car, on the way home, Mariana rested her head on Flavio's shoulder. "You were incredible tonight," she whispered. He smiled. "I just told the truth, a truth that you taught me." They realized that happiness was no longer in the acceptance of that social circle, but in the freedom of no longer needing it. When they arrived home, they were greeted by the smell of carrot cake and laughter coming from the kitchen. Lucia and one of Mariana's brothers were playing cards. The scene was so simple, so common, and yet so extraordinarily rich. They had left behind a world of fake glitter to find a universe of true warmth. The relationship between Flavio and Mariana reached a depth that both had never imagined. The scars of the past did not disappear. They became the map of their love, the lines that showed how far they had come together. The initial passion, based on an illusion, had been replaced by a mature love, an unshakable partnership forged in the fire of truth and forgiveness. Flavio, reflecting on his life, saw with clarity the irony of his journey. The man who prided himself on his vision and his control had been for more than a decade the blindest and, most out of control of all, a prisoner of his own limited certainties. He learned that true strength does not lie in never making a mistake, but in having the humility to recognize the mistake and the courage to repair it. Mariana, for her part, embraced every facet of her identity. The shoe saleswoman, the dedicated student, the loving daughter, the frightened wife. All these women merged into one, a compassionate leader and a fully realized woman whose story of overcoming was now her greatest source of power and inspiration for others. On a sunny afternoon, Flavio found a forgotten business card in his car's console. It was from a small landscaping company that one of his nephews had opened. He took the card, smiled, and put it in his wallet next to his brother-in-law's card. The objects that once represented fear and suspicion were now symbols of pride, of growth, of family. The final scene unfolds on a Sunday night. The entire family is gathered in the large living room. Lucia, surrounded by grandchildren, tells one of her stories, and her laughter fills the room. Flavio watches the scene, his heart flooded with an almost painful gratitude. He looks at each face there, each person he almost rejected out of pure ignorance and prejudice. His gaze crosses Mariana's from across the room. She smiles at him, a smile that contains 13 years of history and an eternity of promises. In that shared silence, they communicate without words. He sees in her his anchor and his wing. She sees in him her harbor and her horizon. The omniscient narrator, who witnessed every step of this journey, concludes that this is not just a story about a lie, but about the redemptive power of truth. A truth that teaches that love is not about finding a perfect person, but about loving an imperfect person perfectly, giving them the security to flourish in their fullness. And so, under the twinkling lights of São Paulo, the united family laughs, talks, and celebrates life. The camera slowly pulls away, leaving behind not the image of a luxurious penthouse, but the image of a vibrant home. The final proof that the greatest of all fortunes is built with the bricks of truth, forgiveness, and a love brave enough to start over.